and yet we cannot find them. And that is something that is pretty universal. Almost every church that reaches out to us at Orange is really asking, how can we get more volunteers from the church to come into our youth ministry? So I don't want you to think that this is a TSA specific problem. This is a church, I wouldn't want to say problem, church issue, but it's even like charities in general. We're really struggling with how do we get people more involved in our ministries? How do we get them more involved in the day-to-day? Now, I know a lot of times when I talk with corps about volunteers, the first thing that I hear quite often is, we don't have any, which is absolutely okay. What I say is, congratulations, you know your very first step. When you don't have any volunteers in your corps, your very first step is to develop a volunteer culture. That's actually something that the TSA does really well. The idea of service is really built in to who we are as a church, especially with the idea of soldiership. We have different places for soldiers, adherents, people who just want to come to our church, who come in and want to be more involved in different aspects of the ministry. But sometimes it really takes an idea of developing that sort of culture from the ground up. That is to say, even if I give you tips and tricks today, your volunteers might not double overnight. This might definitely be a process that's really going to be more foundational. It's really building on the idea of, how do we create a place where people in our church understand that they are needed and necessary, and that we have a place for them. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is what it is really like to develop a volunteer culture. And the first thing is, for anyone in leadership, corps officer, youth leader, the first thing you really need to do is get to know your congregation. These are your people. These are your future volunteers. It really takes, one step is just really getting to know them. People have different personalities. They have different strengths and weaknesses. And we want to look for different leadership skills. Now, one thing I will caution against is labeling leadership skills. Something that people kind of elevate the idea of leadership to almost this unattainable goal. Like, leaders are up here. Maybe you have some people in your corps who think, I can never reach that. I don't have these certain skills, so clearly they're not talking to me. There are different kind of leadership skills. If you have someone in the church who is able to talk to anybody about any topic, that is a great person to ask to help to be on your welcome team. If you have someone in your corps who is amazing at organizing, if you see them in the back, putting your programs in certain piles, or you see them organizing different things in your church, that's a great skill that you can use in so many different aspects of your ministry. So the idea is to really be watchful and mindful of your volunteers, of your people in your church, and just seeing what they're good at. Seeing what is something that someone really seems to gravitate to, what is something that they like to do in the church, and then seeing if that falls into any ministry holes that you have. Another thing is to provide those opportunities. Often we say, we want people to volunteer in the church, but they might not know what you're looking for. They might not know the opportunities that you have for them to volunteer. Something that one corps did in the Western Territory, which I thought was genius, was to create a job board. They posted in their fellowship hall a board of different volunteer opportunities that they had in the corps that were needed. And they also put down maybe the day of the week that they wanted that person to be able to come in, and gave an estimate of about how long it would take to complete that task. They put that job board up, and people in the corps could go up, take one down, sign their name to it, and put it in the offering plate. And then the corps would know that that job is covered. One of the jobs was, if you are using Orange, you know that sometimes in the small group activities, you need materials. Easier if they're separated out. One of the jobs was to have someone come in during the week to separate those materials in tubs for the youth leader, so that they wouldn't have to do that. I know that there was someone in the corps that chose that job that couldn't help on a Sunday. They had their kids of their own. Helping on the Sunday was just not something that they could volunteer for, but they could volunteer to separate those components. So it's providing those opportunities, making sure that they're not just one thing, making sure that they're not just music programs, because there are people in your corps, some of us, who are not musical. And when the only volunteers are musical, sometimes it can feel like we're not needed, we're not necessary. So be sure to provide those opportunities and to vocalize them. Make sure that you are telling people what you have available for them. Another thing that is really important to do is to not try to fill a hole with people, but make sure you're finding opportunities for people that fit their specific needs. So what I mean is, don't just look to fill gaps. Don't just say, I have 5 jobs that I need filled. Let me grab any 5 people and put them into those spots. Number one, there's going to be someone who's given a volunteer job that maybe they don't identify with, maybe they don't know how to do, maybe they're a little bit nervous about and need more instruction, and they don't think that they can volunteer because that wasn't the right role for them. So when we do take the time to get to know our volunteers, instead of just trying to fill holes, we're again creating those opportunities, or we're putting the right people in with the right job. Now, sometimes a person is going to volunteer for a role and it may not be a perfect fit for them. That is absolutely okay. That's when you need to have clear communication with that volunteer and say, thank you so much for volunteering. I feel like maybe for you, this isn't the best fit. I actually can think of something else in the Corps that I think would be a better fit for you, that I think you would be fantastic at. Would you be willing to do this? And that way we're not just putting people in jobs just to get that job done, but we're really making sure that we're allowing our Corps members to feel a part of the church, doing something that they know how to do, doing something that they're good at, something that they feel like you as the officer recognized that skill set in them and that they were given those opportunities. Another thing is to do specific asks. As much as I love that idea of a job board, that is something that gives more of a general ask. Sometimes if you're asking from the pulpit for volunteers, I know this happened to me when I was in a Corps, I always assumed that the Corps officer was not talking to me. Anytime my Corps officer was asking for volunteers, I assumed someone else in the church was going to step up. And I can almost guarantee you, every other person in the congregation was thinking the same thing. They were all thinking, oh no, that guy's going to volunteer. Oh no, she's got this job. And then no one ever steps up because we all just assume someone else has got it. But when you as an officer or youth leader go up to someone and specifically ask them for a job, not only do they feel recognized and seen, but they also know that that's something that you thought about just for them. It isn't just a general ask that comes out of nowhere that anyone and everyone can come up. You're saying, Bob, I need you specifically. I know you're good at this. I would love to put you in this job. That is really going to help with your volunteer retention. When people feel known and seen and they feel like they were specifically asked for a job that they're good at, they're going to want to stay longer. They're going to want to keep going in that job. They know that you specifically need them to keep doing it, that job, and that commitment level is just going to keep going and going and going. And that's another thing to keep in mind is the commitment level of your volunteer opportunities. Try to keep them as flexible as you can. I know when we talk about using Orange, we do always say the best possible thing you could do would be to have a small group leader that commits for a year. I myself am a small group leader for middle school girls, and my church asked for a 3-year commitment. That is a very long commitment. I don't actually know what my life is going to look like in 3 years, but that was something that I felt like I could agree to. 3 years is going to be too long for people. A year might be too long for people. But if we can find ways of having opportunities that our volunteers can actually connect with in that time period that they have, you know, not everyone is going to be able to be a small group leader for a year, but maybe someone could volunteer to come in every other month and be your storyteller. Or once a quarter, they can come in and build your set or decorate your set for that month. It's finding those timelines for them that's going to work for them and not just saying the only commitments we have are 1 year. Because you're going to get some people who say, you know, we have family vacation for 3 months, so clearly I can't, you know, fill that 1 year role, or I already know I travel a lot, so I'm not going to be able to fulfill this. That's good that they know that ahead of time. It's good that we know that might not be the best role for them, but we can still create volunteer opportunities that are flexible for their timelines. So it's allowing flexibility on our part in creating those volunteer jobs. Now we all know there is a pandemic going on. So ministry looks very, very different right now. I'm not sure where everyone is here in Texas, you know, what you're doing with your Corps, but often I've noticed Corps are both in person and virtual, which number one is double work for you as officers. I'm so sorry, and I'm so very appreciative of all that you're doing. But that does open up that you have 2 separate kinds of volunteers that you're looking for. You're looking for in-person volunteers, and you're looking for those online volunteers as well. Those in-person volunteers, again, using those job boards are great, being those flexible commitment times and those personal asks. Those are helpful because you can see the person. You can see them every Sunday and make those asks. When we have online church and when we have digital opportunities, it could feel a little bit different. Especially if we have people who are not good with technology. I will 100% admit that is me quite a bit of the time. The idea of helping and volunteering in a digital space may be a little bit nerve-wracking for them. So something that you can do is offering as a core to teach them to use the digital tools that you are using, like Zoom. Zoom is so helpful to connect our small groups and even our kids together. But if you don't know how to use Zoom, it can sometimes feel a little daunting. It can feel a little bit overwhelming. I definitely suggest doing a Zoom call like this with your congregation, showing them how to use the reaction button, how you can get your kids or your young adults or even your adult groups, if you want to keep everyone muted, they can use the reaction button to respond to things. In Zoom, you can also ask questions by setting up a poll. So that's another way that they can interact on Zoom. But again, if you don't know how to do it, it's really nerve-wracking to be all of a sudden given the job of a small group leader in a digital space if they don't know the technology. If you're using Microsoft Teams, I can't help you because I myself don't understand Microsoft Teams. So you might have volunteers who are really hesitant to jump into that space because the technology is just a little beyond them. So if there's anyone in your core who can help with that, if you have a teenager who is always on their phone, there's your tech support. Maybe reach out to them and ask if they could lead a Zoom call with adults to help. Right now, any sort of digital connection is great. Instagram is where teens are at. Sometimes Instagram is a little beyond us as adults. It's not a space that we're good at. Again, reaching out to those young adults we might have in the core, or teens in the core, and asking them, could you help us create a digital space? Again, that personal ask of helping them, bringing them into the ministry and bringing your core into a digital space that you weren't able to get to before because maybe the lack of understanding of that technology. Again, with a digital volunteer, we have to empower them to be creative. Before we started, I was actually talking with your youth department about what I do with my middle school girls. My church has been fantastic about sending out material that we have not looked at. Completely, being completely, utterly honest here, that's just not where my girls are at. I have middle school, 8th grade girls right now. They're not in the headspace to learn a Sunday school lesson. They are still grappling with what the world looks like right now. So my church has given me a lot of flexibility. Instead of meeting on the lawn at our church, where a lot of people do, we actually meet on one of the girls' front lawns where it's just us together. Instead of having a Zoom call that is, set in stone Sunday mornings at 11:30, my girls don't seem to roll out of bed at that time, which is understandable. Time is a little meaningless right now sometimes. Instead, I set up an open-ended Zoom call that I call a drop-in call. They know that often it's Fridays from 7 to 8, that I have an open Zoom that I send the link out to them. They are free to drop in for 5 minutes. They're free to drop in for 10 minutes or stay the whole hour. Sometimes they come in their pajamas. Sometimes they come dressed in costumes. Sometimes they show up and they wave and they leave. It's just a way of connecting space. And my church understood that instead of having a lesson, my girls just needed connection. So they gave me the flexibility to be creative in this digital space of how we are going to connect. Another thing to do for your small group leaders or any sort of volunteer who's working in a digital space is give them autonomy. I love you, core officers. I love you, youth leaders. You are already doing too much. We need to find ways to delegate to our people. And sometimes that is giving a little bit of the power to them to control some of the digital aspects, like a core Instagram. It's a lot for you to come up with a sermon each week, to check in with your congregations each week, to do all the things you need to do as an officer, and to add those digital aspects on top of it is a lot to ask. But if you can give that over to a volunteer, give them the autonomy to do so. Still have yourself on as, a controller of it, a co-host, still have yourself on in different aspects of being able to overview, but don't feel like you have to control everything. If you're developing a leadership culture, which I know, again, in TSA, that's what we do at our heart, you're already giving them the tools to lead. And now this pandemic is actually almost forcing us to really use those tools and say, hey, we've taught you for so long to lead. Now I need you to step up and do it. Again, this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to be something that needs to be developed. And while we do see the end of the pandemic sort of in sight, this idea of a digital church is not going to go away. We already know that there's going to be some families who are not going to return to our church in the normal sense that we had. They might not come back to the building, but they might continue to watch any digital church items that you create. So it's finding a way of how do we involve volunteers who are going to still be physically in the church, but also finding volunteers who can help us in that digital strategy phase. Again, it's too much for one person. What I try to tell people is we cannot have cores develop a cult of personality. All of your ministry cannot surround you as an officer. All of your ministry cannot even surround your youth leader, because you know you're going to move, and at some point your youth leader is going to move on. And when that happens, I see a lot of programs crumble, because instead of being supported by the core, it's that one officer, it's that one youth leader trying to do everything. But when we delegate, we kind of spread out the responsibility. So when one person leaves, it doesn't crumble the whole ministry. There's someone there who's going to keep it going. I love to tell youth leaders, our job is to really put ourselves out of a job. Our job is to develop the next leaders who are going to take over for us. Same as officers, your job is to develop local leaders who can run the core almost without you. And so we really have to develop them. We really have to give them autonomy to move on and to do this. And it is scary. I will 100% say that. It is something that, again, is a culture that we have to develop. But this pandemic is kind of forcing us in that direction. And I've seen some of the posts on your guys' Texas Facebooks and everything. I know we have great people. We have amazing foundational people in the Salvation Army who are more than willing to step up. We just have to find the perfect place for them. That might mean, not using some programs that have been conventional or traditional in the Army. That might mean starting some that one wouldn't ever see coming. I know right now, I have a nephew, and his one place of connection, they actually just recently moved. He doesn't have any friends. He just moved to a new school. He's not allowed to go to his school. His one connection is gaming. He goes on and he plays with other kids gaming. And I've noticed in the Central Territory, they've actually created a Salvation Army gaming site that connects people on there. What a great volunteer ministry that we have never had before in the Salvation Army. I've never seen a gaming ministry before, but we've noticed in this digital space, that's a need. That's where our people are coming together. And a volunteer in their THQ who just happened to love gaming stepped up and said, hey, can we have this? So maybe there's a teenager who I know loves Fortnite. It's the one game I cannot understand, but apparently is incredibly popular. Maybe they can set up a Fortnite tournament and connect with other people in the core, other adults who like playing the game. And that's another aspect of ministry. It's not something that we might see on our statistics rolls. No one knows gaming ministry, where does that fit in? But it's a ministry that allows connection points. Maybe right now, songsters in singing company isn't quite working, but someone can develop a playlist, a Spotify playlist of music, and send it out to each other, and maybe connect on Zoom and talk about what worship music they talked about this week. Anyone who loves music would be able to step up and to do that. It's not a natural role that we maybe would have thought of, but in this time of digital connection, it's just another connection point that we can have. So right now, it's allowing ourselves creativity and allowing our core people creativity. But this really calls for raw honesty with your core people. I know it's so hard to connect right now. If you're not in the building, how can we connect with all of our cores? But if you have a core Facebook page or a core Instagram, or even just a core email chain, write to each other and say, hey, I miss you all as a congregation while we're not able to meet. What are some things that you guys are good at? What are some things that you like to do? Maybe someone really loves coffee. Maybe they can lead a Zoom class and connect and teach everyone how to make a great cup of coffee at home. That is a ministry, my friend, right now. I am drinking very terrible coffee. So if any of you guys start one of those, please let me in. But that could be a great point of someone who maybe thought that their love of coffee could never be useful for the core. But here it is, being useful. But there's something that's really important after we've developed this volunteer culture and after we've really worked hard to retain them in their roles, is to show appreciation. And sometimes this looks big, sometimes this looks small, but we really have to show our core people, our volunteers, how much we appreciate them. As the body of Christ, you know, we're all working together as the whole, but sometimes the arm gets tired and they need a little pick-me-up. Sometimes that leg is burnt out and they just need to know that they are needed in the body. And that's something that I think, again, officers are so creative, finding fun ways to recognize your volunteers. This doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to spend a ton of money. My favorite thing is now in the 252 curriculum in the Prelude folder, every month we're including something fun to show appreciation to your volunteers. One time it was a candy bar wrapper. One time it was a postcard that you can send your volunteers. Whatever you can do to connect with your volunteers and let them know, I see your effort. I see what you're doing and it's so appreciated. If you're in the building, again, my favorite thing about TSA is coffee and cookies. Thank you for feeding us on Sundays. I think that was my breakfast my entire childhood. But maybe even having a separate volunteer table where someone's making fancy coffees for those volunteers. Maybe it's specifically getting them a mug, reusable, sustainable mug that they can use on a Sunday, write their name on it, maybe decorate that mug and back that special mug for that volunteer. It's finding little ways of showing appreciation. I love personal notes. I think I've saved every note that anyone has ever written me in the box. Just writing a letter to your volunteers is huge. Everyone loves mail. No one hates a mail that's not a piece of bill or right now a election mailer. I know we're all a little burnt out on. Sending in a postcard just saying, hey, we know what you're doing and we really appreciate you. That's huge. That's big in developing that culture. It's when we show appreciation, again, that's going to make your volunteers want to stay when they know that they are an integral part of the core, that they are needed and necessary for your ministry to keep going. That's when volunteers really feel like they're a part of something. And that's when they're going to stay. So it's really, you guys are already kind of doing what you need to do. Like TSA is so great on service. You guys are already there. It's just making sure we're being really intentional with our asks, intentional with our thank yous and appreciation, and intentional with the digital spaces that we've been given. How are we going to elevate these things in the future with our volunteers? So I really just want to encourage you guys to keep doing what you're already doing, to allow yourself to give up a little bit of control to someone in your core that maybe you never thought could step up. Again, to make sure leadership doesn't look like this mystical thing that's so far away that people can't attain. But let everyone know in your core, you're already leaders. We just want to find the space for you. You are already volunteers. We just want to find the perfect spot for you because we know God brought you to this core for a reason. So again, it's that intentionality point. That's something that I love about Orange. That's something that I love about TSA, just being really intentional with our people, saying thank you, we appreciate you, and that we need you even more. So that's all for me, but I would love to hear if you guys have any specific questions, comments, concerns. You know, this is our space to where we can also share with one another. Because as much as I've gained some knowledge, you guys are on the front lines of ministry, so you could also give ideas to one another. So if anyone has any questions or anything, now is a great time to share.